It's automatically being recorded. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We can see you starting to come on in. We're so excited for tonight's webinar. This one's going to be so fun, a little bit different than some of the other ones we've done, and it's going to be so fun. We've got a lovely large crew attending tonight, which is so nice to see. Welcome, welcome. Give everyone just a minute or two to kind of let everyone come on in from assuming across Canada, and you never know. We always have at least a couple people attending internationally, which is always a hoot. We like to hear if you're from somewhere far away, let us know. There's no prize, but you know, gives us a kick. Okay, we're still filling up, so we'll give it another minute here. Welcome to Canadians for Homeopathy webinars. It's so much fun to have everyone. Right, it's starting to trickle, so I think the big entering the room rush is getting there. So fabulous. Okay, well, welcome. My name is Erin Ellis, and I'm here with Victor Chirone, and we are both committee members of Canadians for Homeopathy. And I'm so happy to be your host and moderator tonight. We are Canadians for Homeopathy. So this is, we're a grassroots organization. If you're here, you probably know something about us, but we are a grassroots organization who we're focused on raising awareness about homeopathy for all Canadians. Letting Canadians get to know about homeopathy, and you can see our kind of 4 mission pillars there: educate, communicate, advocate, and celebrate. This is our approach to getting the word about homeopathy out there, and one of the ways we do that is our webinars. So we are so proud to offer these webinars. They are definitely our sort of flagship offering and our most popular kind of thing we offer. So they are always free to watch live. We usually have them on Mondays at around this time, about once a month, and we are we're thrilled to be doing this one. So we've got a few more people coming in, and I see that there's a couple of questions. So just in case something's not going right on the technical end, I'm just going to check out and see what those are. Okay, perfect. Oh, hello from Tilsonburg. That's wonderful, from Ontario. There's a question about recording. The recording will be available on our website within a few days of this. So that will be available there. We don't send it out to participants, but that'll be how it is. It looks like the chat feature is disabled. I'm going to see what I can do to work on that, but people are popping things into the Q&A, so that's good. Let me I'll work on that once we get started here, and see if we can open up the chat. So that takes us to a little bit of business, which is, if I can get the chat working, and I hope I can, I'm gonna do my best. Feel free to chat with each other, all that there. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them, so everyone can participate. So Canadians for Homeopathy, there's our contact information, and we'll get this webinar started. Victor, do you want to give us the next slide there, please?
Yep. There we go.
Awesome. Wonderful. So tonight is we have a presentation by the wonderful Victor Chirone. The webinar is called The Hidden History of Homeopathy. So we're going to learn lots of really cool stuff. And I have just had the best time chatting with Victor before this started. So it's going to be really interesting and exciting. We're going to talk about the law of similars, and he's going to place everything, a lot, homeopathy in a historical context for us. So I think it's going to be really fun and exciting. We are going to do questions at the end. Victor's just going to present straight through, so we won't be pausing for questions midway, but please pop them in the Q&A as you go, and then we'll go through them all at the end. Stick around after, and we'll Victor will answer everything he can. And I think with that, I'm just going to check if there's any more technicalities. Perfect. Yeah, someone asked about the Q&A. They can only see their own question. I believe that is the setting we have, that you only see your own, not all the questions that have been posed. So go ahead and fire them in there. And I'll pop off oh, sorry, Victor, I was going to tell people a little more about you. My apologies. I got distracted by
Sure, go ahead.
Hey there. So yeah, my apologies. So Victor is a registered homeopath and a clinical herbalist, and he's based out of Manitoulin Island, Ontario. So he practices homeopathy and herbal medicine because of their immense transformative powers that these healing modalities contain, both on an individual and a collective level of experience. Victor values direct experience, careful and attentive observation, and always strives to engage with his patients in a way that is authentic and deeply healing. He employs a range of medicines in his practice to suit the needs of the individual on their journey towards wholeness. In addition to homeopathy and herbal medicine, Victor has an extensive background in Jungian archetypal psychology, psychoanalysis, anthroposophy, and the esoteric and symbolic dimensions of the healing arts more broadly. And you can find him at his website, www.victorchirone.com. That's VICTORCIRONE.com, and we'll give you that website again at the end in case you want to find Victor. Find Victor and chat with him further. So I'm going to pop off and let you get started on the webinar here, Victor.
Great, thanks so much. I'm very happy to be here with everyone tonight. And as the title of the talk suggests, we're going to be talking about the history of homeopathy, specifically what I'm calling the hidden history of homeopathy. And the history of homeopathy in general is a huge topic. We could spend days and days talking about all the very interesting things that led to the development of homeopathic medicine and how things progressed from the time of Hahnemann until today. It's a huge topic. So we're kind of really focusing in and looking at some particular things that provide a background and context to try and understand some of Hahnemann's discoveries and where some of his inspiration that is often unrecognized or unacknowledged may have come from. And so to start, we'll just look at the word homeopathy because it's important to understand what it actually means. So homeopathic medicine, as many of you are probably aware, is based on the law of similars, which is to say, like curing like. Now, what does this mean? Where does this notion come from? And the word homeopathy itself is made up of the prefix homeo, which means the same, and the suffix patho, which means suffering or disease. So treating disease, treating suffering through the use of similar substances. And Hahnemann contrasted the homeopathic method with the allopathic method, which is philosophically and practically oriented around the use of opposites. And what we're going to be looking at as our starting point is this notion of the law of similars. What does it mean, like is cured by like, using similars in the treatment of diseases rather than the use of opposites? And as we can see at the bottom here, there's a quote that's attributed to Hippocrates, who's often called the father of Western medicine. And he said, by similar things, a disease is produced, and through the application of the like is cured. So we see many examples of this notion of the law of similars being employed throughout history, going back a very, very long time indeed. So early in his career, Hahnemann became disillusioned with the state of medical practice. This is a quote from Wenda Brewster O'Reilly, who was the translator of a version of Hahnemann's Organon. And she discusses how he actually gave up the practice of medicine because he felt that he was doing more harm than good. And during this time, when he wasn't practicing, he gave up the conventional approach that he was trained in because it wasn't really producing the results that he wanted to see for his patients. He turned to translation, and he was translating medical texts. So we know from the very beginning that Hahnemann was very well read in the history of medicine. And this is what he spent his life doing. He spent his life translating medical texts. And so he was immersed in all sorts of traditions and all sorts of ideas, and was one day translating the text of William Cullen, who was a Scottish physician, who was translating his Materia Medica, which is Materia Medica is a collection of, medical material, you could say. It's information about particular medicines, specific medicines that are used in a given practice. And essentially, during this translation, Hahnemann came across a section where Cullen started talking about a herb called cinchona, or Peruvian bark. And Cullen said that the Peruvian bark was useful in the treatment of malaria, which it was being used for because of its bitter and astringent properties. And so Hahnemann was not satisfied with this explanation, because he said, well, hold on a second, there are many herbs that are both bitter and astringent that are not useful in the treatment of malaria. So how is it that we have this one particular herb that seems to be useful in this disease condition, where others that don't have the same property are not? So he started to question Cullen's assertion. And this led him to start to experiment. And he took regular doses of cinchona until he started to exhibit symptoms himself. And what ended up happening was he realized that the cinchona bark produced many of the characteristic symptoms of malaria, but to a milder degree than one would see in a patient that was actually infected by the disease. And this was a very important experiment because Hahnemann came to the realization and recognition that there are inherent properties of medicines that go beyond their taste profile, that go beyond things that we can associate just by looking at the medicine and just by tasting it and empirically, getting to know it in that more superficial sense. Hahnemann was interested in the core properties of medicines. And this is one of the hallmarks of his experimentation that led him to develop the notion of healing through similars. So the effects of taking cinchona are similar to, but not identical to, the symptoms of malaria. It's not that when you take cinchona, you come down with malaria, obviously. But this experiment discovered that a medicinal substance, when taken at a sufficiently large dose or repeated doses over a period of time, produces a set of unique and characteristic symptoms. And that those unique and characteristic symptoms that are a consequence of what came to be called a proving of a medicine, a test of the medicine, to see what symptoms it would elicit, that then establishes a profile of what that medicine might be used for if a sick person comes in and they themselves have a particular set of symptoms that they're seeking relief from. We then match that set of symptoms of the sick person to the most similar set of symptoms that we find are inherent in a particular substance. And Hahnemann, always being concerned with providing his patients with the most robust healing possible, experimented with dosage. And he found that when a medicine is administered in a potentized form, which is to say, being subjected to ultra high dilution and succussion or rhythmic shaking, the remedies then dynamized or potentized, that this allows for the potential negative effects of that substance, which might come about when you take large doses of a substance in order to elicit a proving, for example, that these negative consequences are greatly mitigated when the medicine has been properly potentized, when it's been prepared as an ultra-high dilution. Not only are the negative effects mitigated, but the healing potential is also greatly increased. And this was of concern for Hahnemann, especially when we consider the fact that during his time, there were very many toxic substances that were being used in conventional medicine, such as mercury in the treatment of syphilis. And now Hahnemann recognized, for example, the utility of mercury as a medicine, but he was not fond of the negative consequences that came about through its use as a crude substance being given to patients. So he experimented with creating his own versions of mercury as a medicine. He experimented with diluting mercury to the point where you were still able to obtain a medicinal curative effect from its use without causing hazardous toxic consequences. So this is just some background to try and understand what was in Hahnemann's mind. What were the problems that he was facing that led him to discover this system of healing through similars that got him to work with the law of similars in a deeper way. And this is just a point of contrast, you could say. This is a great example of the conventional, what Hahnemann called allopathic medicine of his time. And this is a quote which comes from the work of Harris Coulter, who was a great medical historian and wrote a lot about the history of homeopathy, specifically the history of homeopathy in America. And he wrote about Benjamin Rush, who was probably the most respected American physician of the late 18th and early 19th century. And Rush was a big promoter of bloodletting and of mercury, specifically in the treatment of yellow fever. And so there was an outbreak of the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia, and Rush went in his carriage to address the crowds there. And this is what he said. There were several hundred people who were in front of Rush, and Rush, without stepping down, threw back the top of his curricle and addressed the multitude with a few conciliatory remarks. He cried in a loud voice, "I treat my patients successfully by bloodletting and copious purging with mercury chloride and gelap, which is a highly toxic laxative stimulant herb. I advise you, my good friends, to use the same remedies." "What?" called the voice from the crowd. "Bleed and purge everyone?" "Yes," said the doctor. "Bleed and purge all Kensington. Drive on, Ben." And so we can see how barbaric these methods were. Everyone who came down with yellow fever, Benjamin Rush was advocating bloodletting, mercury, and laxative stimulant herbs too. So there was no regard for individualization. There's no regard for even deeply understanding the disease. It's a very crude method, and this is in large part what the background of the medical establishment that Hahnemann was originally coming from, in which he stopped practicing medicine. This is what was going on. These were the mainstream medical practices of Hahnemann's time, which he positioned homeopathy in strong opposition to. He placed homeopathy in strong opposition to. And so Hahnemann was constantly deriding the material view of disease, which is very much what Benjamin Rush and others were promulgating. The idea is that the body has become overwhelmed by a material force or an infective agent of some kind, and that it needs to be purged. It needs to be, purged is probably the best word, purged of the infirmity of the disease matter that's come in to the body. And we do this by bloodletting. We do this through detoxification methods. And the basic idea is that the body doesn't have any mechanisms of its own. It doesn't have any innate vitality or intelligence that we can then mobilize to overcome the disease. The idea is we have to, it's in a sense, remove the offending matter from the body through these means such as bloodletting. And so Hahnemann argued that there is an immaterial principle, the vital force or the life principle, that governs the life of the organism in states of health and disease. And so for Hahnemann, disease is always a consequence of the mistunment or derangement of the life principle, which he said is brought out by inimical potency or a malefic, supersensible, spirit-like influence. That's how Hahnemann describes disease. And we see this in one of his aphorisms where he writes, "A natural disease is never to be regarded as some noxious matter situated somewhere inside or outside the person," which is the view of Benjamin Rush, right? the disease is some noxious matter that's come inside the person, and we have to get it out. We have to purge them. We have to eliminate the disease through these intense, detoxification and purgative methods. Rather, Hahnemann says, natural disease is engendered by a spirit-like inimical potency that disturbs, as if by a kind of contagion, the spirit-like life principle that reigns with its instinctual governance in the entire organism. Like an evil spirit, it torments the life principle, forcing it to engender certain sufferings and disorders in the course of its life. These are known as symptoms or diseases. And so Hahnemann is basically saying that the life principle, the vital force, the homeostatic controller of the entire human organism, today in contemporary scientific language, we might call it the psychoneuroendocrine immune axis. It's that invisible homeostatic controller of the entire human organism. We can't point to it. It doesn't exist in any one place in particular, but it's what unifies, unites, and provides a coherence to the whole. And Hahnemann says that in health and in disease, the vital force is what is determining the overall state of health of the person. In disease, there is a kind of spirit-like contagion that has affected the functioning of the vital force and has resulted in the vital force operating in a way that it starts to elicit symptoms. And these symptoms are nothing other than the vital force of the organism giving signs as to where it is blocked, where the obstruction is. For a homeopath, those symptoms then become the key to understanding what the organism needs to restore vitality, to restore integrity to itself. And here's another example of Hahnemann speaking against the material view of disease, speaking against the notion that there are material causes of disease, either blood excess or some other kind of disease material that's come into the person. And he criticizes the allopaths who try to sweep away the fancy disease matter and to conduct it elsewhere under the delusion of being able to weaken and eradicate the disease, as if it was something other than the person, the vital force of the person that was eliciting those symptoms. And so Hahnemann also was an advocate of thinking of disease as a dynamic phenomena. And he says that disease does not rest on any material, on any acridity, on no disease matter. Diseases are spirit-like, dynamic mistunings of, again, spirit-like enlivening power, force, energy, the life principle, the life force of the human body. Disease is nothing other than the vital force giving symptoms, giving indications as to how it has been blocked from functioning in its optimal manner. This is somewhat of an original idea. Most people think that disease is caused by some kind of physical substance. But this is not Hahnemann's view. Even when it comes to thinking about chronic diseases, Hahnemann was very clear that chronic diseases that may have physical consequences never start as a purely local physical phenomena. They start as a global phenomena. They start on the level of the vitality of the constitutional health of the person. And the physical symptoms are, in a way, epiphenomena or consequences of the larger global disturbance. That's part of what Hahnemann means, that disease is a dynamic phenomena. It's not a purely local or isolated occurrence. But where did these ideas come from? Where did these ideas of disease as a spirit-like entity come to Hahnemann? What are these notions? And so for some understanding of this, we can look to the alchemical tradition. And this is where this notion of the hidden history of homeopathy comes in, because the alchemists were thinking in the very same terms of thinking of disease as a spiritual phenomena, as an immaterial or spiritual phenomena, rather than a physical phenomena. And so here we have an image of Paracelsus, and his dates are 1493 to 1541. And this, there's a Latin saying underneath of his portrait here. This is the one to whom the great mysteries of the world were known, and who was able to restore the art of magic from the fall, which is to say the art of the fall from paradise, right? Paracelsus was a physician of such great esteem and of such great insight that he was able to restore the mysteries inherent in nature and to use them, to utilize them to help the sufferings of humanity. We won't say much about the life of Paracelsus. We're more interested in his ideas today. We could give an entire webinar talking about the life of Hahnemann, the life of Paracelsus, but we have to choose our focus here. So we're going to be talking about the ideas. And so for Paracelsus, disease, just as for Hahnemann, disease was not to be understood as a materially based phenomena. The same is true for Hahnemann, who understood that disease is a mistunement or derangement of the vital force, the dynamic spiritual principle that animates and governs the life of the organism. And so Hahnemann and Paracelsus were both at odds with the medical establishments of their time. And the reason was the same. The reason was that both of them understood that the underlying causes of diseases could not be approached through mechanical, chemical, or physiological modes of understanding. Right? That's what Benjamin Rush was trying to do. He was trying to treat malaria by approaching it as a materially based phenomena. If we just bleed and purge everyone, then we're going to take care of malaria. We rid the physical matter of the offending substance. Hahnemann and Paracelsus both took the complete opposite view. They maintained that also disease is not without meaning, and that it can even possess a transformative power. So this is a great quote from Franz Hartmann. If you look up Franz Hartmann, there's two of them. One of them was a homeopath. The other was also a physician who used some homeopathy, but was actually more interested in alchemy and the Paracelsian tradition. And so this comes not from the homeopath Franz Hartmann, but from the occult physician, the alchemical physician Franz Hartmann. And here's another great image of Paracelsus. And he writes, "Why is the practice of medicine of Paracelsus almost incomprehensible to the modern practitioner? It's because the latter seeks to treat the diseased organs themselves, which are such merely the external effects of the internal causes. And he knows of no other way to act upon them except by mechanical or chemical means, while the method of treatment of Paracelsus, by means of which he made the most wonderful cures, is to change the interior spiritual causes from which the outward effects grow, to treat the very essences out of which the corporeal organs become crystallized, and to supply them with the power of vitality of the quality which they require." This is exactly what Hahnemann was trying to do. Hahnemann was trying to treat the interior spiritual causes from which the outward effects of disease grows. Because if you treat the outward effects, maybe you can suppress the disease. Maybe you can provide some kind of temporary amelioration, but you're not going to arrive at a really profound transformative cure of the patient. You're not going to really understand what is causing the symptoms. You're not going to understand what is at the core of the patient's suffering unless you're able to treat the very essence, or to touch on the level of the vital force, which is the controller of the whole organism on every level. And so to effect a cure on the innermost spiritual causes of disease is the shared aim of both the medicine, the alchemical medicine of Paracelsus, and the homeopathy of Hahnemann. Both Paracelsus and Hahnemann postulated the existence of an immaterial vital force that regulates and governs the body in health and disease. The vital force is a single universal principle of life that oversees all the parts that make up the whole. If the life principle is functioning harmoniously, health is the result. If it's obstructed or impeded, disease is the consequence. So this is now a slide which discusses the notion of what we can call the vital force in Hahnemann's language. Paracelsus called it the archeus. So the archeus is a word from the Greek arche, and the Greek word arche means the first principle from which all other principles are derived. It also means beginning, origin, source. And so the opening of the book of Genesis, in the beginning God created, the word is the beginning in the Greek Septuagint translation of the Bible is arche. Arche is the beginning. So the archeus, as a principle of the human form and of the human being is an essence, and this is a quote from Paracelsus, is an essence that is equally distributed in all parts of the human body. If the latter is in a healthy condition, it is the invisible nutriment from which the visible body draws its strength, and the qualities of each of its parts correspond to the nature of the physical parts that contain it. So here Paracelsus says, the spiritus vitus, which is the spirit of life, takes its origin from the spiritus mundi, the spirit of the world. So the spirit of life is an emanation of the spirit of the world and contains all the elements of all the cosmic influences. Now, we can start to see why Hahnemann maybe shied away from associating himself with the alchemists. Hahnemann did not talk in this kind of mystical language. He didn't talk of the spirit of life originating from or being an emanation of the spirit of the world. But the essence of what Paracelsus is saying here is completely in line with what Hahnemann is saying, that there is an essence, an invisible essence that's distributed through all parts of the human body, and in the healthy state is what provides radiance, is what provides vitality, is what provides strength, and is also, when in a disturbed state, what produces and elicits symptoms. And we have an image here. It's an engraving from the work of Robert Flood, who was an alchemist. And I'm happy to share the slides with anyone who wants to look at the slides in more detail. We see basically here the anima mundi, the world soul, and the emanation of all life coming from this primeval originary source, which is what Paracelsus is talking about here, that the spirit of life emanates from the spirit of the world. Okay, so we have a little bit of a sense now of what the law of similars is. We have a sense that the law of similars is tied in with this notion of the vital force, or what Paracelsus called the archeus. But what does the law of similars look like in practice? And what can the practice of homeopathy tell us about its history? What can the practice of homeopathy suggest further in terms of our understanding of the connections between the homeopathic medical tradition and the alchemical medical tradition? What does it mean to say that there is a similarity between a state of disease and the curative powers of a specific medicine? Well, when we start thinking of this question here, the similarity between a state of disease and the curative powers of a specific medicine, well, this is an idea that states of disease, as well as states of health, all possible states of human experience, are reflections of processes that are happening in the external world. We're mirrors. This is what is going on with the law of similars. This is the essence of what Paracelsus was saying, that the spirit of life emanates from the spirit of the world. The spirit of life is nothing other than a reflection of macrocosmic processes that are happening in the outer world. The inner human experience is nothing other than a mirror, a reflection of these larger global, even cosmic processes that are happening outside of us. And the law of similars respects this insight from Paracelsus. Paracelsus uses mystical language to describe it. Hahnemann doesn't, but it's the same basic idea. So we have some quotes here that I thought were really great and help us to get into this deeper understanding of what the law of similars looks like in practice. We have a quote from Novalis. Novalis says, "Every disease is a musical problem. Every cure is a musical solution." And we have a quote from James Tyler Kent, who is a very famous American homeopath. And Kent says, "We have in the image of the disease an exact representation of the image of a remedy," which is to say that there are correspondences between states of disease and the energetic properties of given substances that are taken from nature. And the higher the degree of similarity, the higher the degree of correspondence between a state of disease and the curative powers or the energetic inherent properties of a given substance, the greater the possibility the medicine has to produce a profound curative effect. So here is, here's a great image. I thought this was a really, really nice image to illustrate the idea that we're going to discuss right now. This is a mandala of evolution. We see this primordial point of origin, from the beginning, and all of life emanating from it. So this is a quote from Edward Whitmont, who was a homeopath and a Jungian psychologist, and he did a lot of work to bridge the traditions of homeopathy and Jungian psychology, and was one of the first people to directly argue that there was a clear link between the homeopathy of Hahnemann and the alchemical traditions of the past. So Whitmont writes, and we'll unpack this quote: every existing substance, when subjected to the proving experiment, and remember, a proving is when we give a medicine, either in the crude form or in the potentized form, to a person or group of people, such that they then start to elicit symptoms. So every existing substance, when subjected to the proving experiment, exhibits a similarity, hence also a healing capacity for some human or animal disturbed state. And in view of the immense number of still unproven substances, we may well assume that for every possibility of human affliction, there exists a healing substance out there. We confront here the amazing fact that psychobiological response patterns that are aspects of the human life drama are duplicated in the structural and life activity of the Earth's substances. The psychosomatic totalities of ill persons and medicines appear as similar field patterns, mutually inclusive of human organism and non-human external and supposedly inanimate substances. So what is Whitmont saying here? He's basically saying that through the homeopathic proving and our understanding of healing through similars, that we begin to understand that there are patterns. He calls them psychobiological response patterns that are aspects of the human life drama. So states of health and disease, aspects of certain dispositions, of certain characters, of preferences, of likes and dislikes, but most specifically, patterns of disease that are duplicated in the structural and life activity of the Earth's substances. We find that there are similar field patterns that are underlying both states of human disease and energetic foundational building blocks of all of life. That the human life trauma is nothing other than a reflection of these broader patterns that exist everywhere in nature, which is why Whitman says that for every human affliction, there exists a healing substance out there, because every human affliction is always already a reflection of a process that occurs somewhere in nature, that's inherent somewhere in nature. The contemporary homeopath Rajan Sankran talks of disease as a song. He says that it's a non-human song that is playing out, it's expressing itself inside the human being. And that song is perfect in itself, but it doesn't belong inside the human being. So what we have to do as homeopaths is learn to listen to that song, learn to listen where it comes from, and find that source, find that substance that is the match for that pattern that underlies the state of disease. And when we give that medicine, the human song is able to come through. The non-human pattern or the non-human song that is causing a discordance inside the human being is liberated when we prescribe the simillimum, when we prescribe the most similar substance. But the most similar substance is nothing other than the pattern that it already exists somewhere in nature. That's what Whitman is saying here. And that's what Paracelsus is saying, right? The spirit of life is an emanation of the spirit of the world. So I kind of condensed what Whitman is saying. Consciousness, substance, energy, and life, these terms are the same. Consciousness, substance, energy, and life all mean the same thing. Homeopathy is the proof of this. Alchemy is the proof of this. And there's a continuum in which the inverse or the opposite of the self is identical with the inverse of all objects. And what underlies both the self, both the experience of being alive in a human being, and what underlies the existence of all beings is a field of meaning. And as homeopaths, what we're dealing with is nothing other than fields of meaning that underlie life. We're dealing with consciousness, substance, energy, life, meaning. All of these things are the same. And what we're trying to do is deeply perceive what the pattern is that underlies the state of ill health, the state of disturbed health in the patient. And when we can understand that, when we see that image, right? Like Kent says, for every remedy contains or corresponds to an image of disease. There is a correspondence. And later in that quote, Kent goes on to say, does this happen by chance? And Ken says that a practitioner cannot recognize this fact and not recognize the existence of God. They recognize the existence of a higher organizing principle of the universe because it's full of meaning, it's full of intent. And so this brings us to, of course, the great Hermetic and alchemical maxim, as above, so below, as within, so without, as the universe, so the soul. And this is a quote that's attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. It speaks for itself, and it summarizes, in my mind, the essence both of homeopathy and of alchemy. The homeopathic law of similars is, in this light, seen to be strikingly analogous to the Hermetic maxim, as above, so below. Both principles are focused on the correspondences that unify the microcosm, the individual, and the macrocosm, the greater context in which the individual exists, in which life takes shape, in which life takes form, in which life derives its meaning. So here are some other examples. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide. This is a notion of the principle of individualization that we see in the work of Jean-Baptiste von Helmont, who was an immediate predecessor of Paracelsus. And it's very striking that you see that the alchemists were also interested in the principles that Hahnemann was interested in terms of how to treat diseased patients. And he says here, I do not know epilepsy, lepra, apoplexy, or strokes. I only know individuals, epileptics, lepers, apoplectics, for disease only exists as a modification of life. That's exactly what Hahnemann says. Disease is a modification of the life principle, of the vital force. There are no diseases that are only sick men. That's exactly what Hahnemann says. And as a consequence, when you realize this, when you realize that there are no diseases as such, there's only sick individuals whose vital force has been disturbed, you have to treat the individual. You have to treat the individual person and understand that individual in their innermost essence if you are to arrive at a cure. So the alchemists were very much concerned with this notion of not only healing through similars, which Paracelsus and Van Helmont also did. The alchemists were also very much concerned with healing through single substances. They used many simple remedies. They did not use 50, 60, 70 different herbs or different kinds of compounds in combination with each other. And one other thing that I'll mention that I think is very important, the alchemists were some of the first to introduce the use of metals in medical practice of their time. Before the alchemists, most of the healing profession was done with plant and animal substances. Metals were thought to be mostly inert. They were thought to have no curative powers. And we see in Hahnemann, of course, the extensive use of mineral and metallic remedies. And this is, in and of itself, a lineage that comes from the alchemical tradition. Here's more on Paracelsus. And this is here Paracelsus talking about observing the internal character of the human being and learning to also to perceive the inner character of curative substances, of matter, of the specific nature of medicines. And the homeopath John Henry Clark, this is a great essay for anyone who wants to dive a little bit deeper into the relationship between Hahnemann and Paracelsus. He was also one of the first homeopaths to really draw attention to the debt that Hahnemann owed to Paracelsus and the alchemical tradition. But he explains that vision must come before comprehension. You have to be able to deeply perceive what is going on before you can begin to understand how to come about with a treatment. Our treatments have to be based on vision, and vision entails understanding the functioning of the principle of life in the individual. So again, for anyone who wants to look at these slides in more detail, and this slide specifically goes into the doctrine of signatures. Hahnemann spoke out against the doctrine of signatures. This may have been actually an attempt of Hahnemann to try and distance himself from the alchemical tradition, because the way that he talks about it in his Organized is very simplistic, and Hahnemann knew better. He knew that the notion of signatures in Paracelsus and in the alchemists was much more sophisticated than just thinking that because the plant is yellow, that it's good for the gallbladder. The doctrine of signatures is much more extensive, much more sophisticated than that. And this slide goes into that notion, specifically as it pertains to Hahnemann and the development of homeopathic medicine. Here we have the alchemical symbols of sulfur, salt, and mercury. And right away, immediately, and we'll talk about what these mean in the alchemical context, but for anyone that knows homeopathy, you know that these are three of our biggest remedies. Why? When you read Hahnemann's Materia Medica Pura and you look at his chronic diseases, the three remedies that have the most entries, that are written about the most, are sulfur, salt, and mercury. Salt being natrum muriaticum. This is not coincidence. Hahnemann was expressing his debt to the alchemists by giving these remedies so much attention. He was so interested in these principles, not because of any other reason than the fact that they were the pillars on which the alchemical understanding, not only of health and disease, but of the entire world was based. And here we have a quote from Jan Scholten, and he says something. This is Jan Scholten's periodic table, beautiful layout of the periodic table. And Jan Scholten, when he's asked in an interview about the connection between homeopathy and alchemy, he says, the whole of homeopathy is alchemy. The whole way of making potencies is like alchemy, right? What was Paracelsus trying to do? Paracelsus was trying to make spiritualized medicines. You see this over and over and over again when Paracelsus talks about the aim of medical treatment. When he says you have to treat the innermost spiritual causes of disease, well, you need medicines that are spiritualized substances if you are to treat the innermost spiritual causes, right? So the homeopathic method of making potencies is a kind of alchemy. What they're doing in the homeopathic laboratories is a kind of alchemy. We're spiritualizing matter. That's what the alchemists were doing. So Scholten says, when you read the old stories about alchemy, you do it over and over and over again. You purify substances and make it more and more and more spiritual. You remove the material sheath and liberate this principle of the spirit that's trapped in matter. That's what the alchemists were trying to do. That's what Hahnemann was trying to do. What's also a connection is that you use substances, but the real development is in the mind. It's the same in homeopathy, and the body follows. It's all the same. And this is true. When you prescribe a remedy to a patient, I really like to see insight come first. When there's a change on the level of insight, when the patient comes back and they say, I took the remedy and I realized such and such. Even though the physical symptoms are still there, they have gained perspective on their situation. And so if we can touch that level of insight on the level of soul and the level of the spirit through our remedies, then we know that the development on the physical is going to inevitably follow. The alchemists were concerned with this too. They thought that you need to reach, again, the innermost spiritual causes of disease. That is the insight, that is the mind, that is the spirit, that is the soul. Scholten says, Hahnemann was an alchemist. And in alchemy, you have three basic substances, sulfur, salt, and mercury. Those are the most known remedies when you read, as we said, the Materia Medica Pura and chronic diseases of Hahnemann. Those remedies have the most symptoms. Hahnemann doesn't state it so obviously, but he was an alchemist. Or he was very much not in the sense that he was only an alchemist, but he had a lot of things going on there. Those three substances are just symbolic. As substances themselves, they aren't more prominent than another one. And this is a great point. Why these three substances? Why was Hahnemann so interested in them, right? Graphites, carbon, is much more prevalent on the earth than is sulfur. Why did Hahnemann give so much emphasis to sulfur? Why was it such a pillar of his system? He gave emphasis to graphites too, but sulfur was so important for Hahnemann. There was a point in Hahnemann's practice when he was starting all his patients on sulfur. It wasn't because of any other reason than the fact that he understood it in an alchemical sense. So here we have, this image is a three-headed monster in an alchemical flask representing the composition of the philosopher's stone, which is made up of salt, sulfur, and mercury. And so we have here a description of the three principles, which are not to be, so salt, sulfur, and mercury. And these three principles are not to be thought of in the sense of substances. They're not crude sulfur, crude salt, or crude mercury, right? There is, in all objects, all all natural objects contain a combination of these three principles. And so we have here a great description that illustrates what these principles actually are in the objects of nature. So we have something that makes them combustible and gives them body, substance, and structure. That's their sulfur. There's also something that makes them solid and gives them color and solidity, that coagulates them. That's their salt. And finally, something in their constitution that makes them fluid or vaporous, that confers upon them virtues, power, and arcana. And that is their mercury. So we have the combustible, the vaporous, and the solid. And so these are the basic constituents of all matter, according to the alchemists: the sulfur, the mercury, and the salt. And this is why Hahnemann was so interested in these remedies, because he understood that they were foundational to all of life. Okay, so here we have also an understanding of the use of the metals. So I'm not going to read this quote, but this is a quote from Italian homeopath Massimo Mangialavori, and he shows here the importance that Hahnemann gave to the 7 metals of the alchemists. We have gold, we have iron, we have tin, we have lead, we have silver, we have mercury, and we have copper. All of these metals, which were the 7 metals of the alchemists. And all of these had, as you can see, correspondences to days of the week, also planetary correspondences. The 7 metals of the alchemists, this was a very important pillar of the alchemical medicine. These are archetypal principles, right? They're archetypes. They're principles that extend beyond the embodiment in a particular form. So we're not just concerned with gold as a crude substance. We're concerned as gold, or the sun, as an archetypal power that extends and is manifest in all life. And so Hahnemann took special interest in the 7 metals of the alchemists. In fact, Hahnemann did provings of all 7 of these metals. There were many other substances that Hahnemann could have done provings of. Why did he choose these? He chose them because they had a very deep significance for the alchemists. And he was deeply interested in the archetypal healing forces that were attributed to these substances. Here we see another map of the 7 metals of the alchemists and their correspondences to days of the week, and their planetary correspondences, and also to different parts of the body, right? So we see that the sun has a correspondence to the heart, silver and the moon to the head, and so on and so on and so on. And so these, again, are archetypal formative forces. They're powers that exist in the cosmos that are reflected in the microcosm, that are reflected in the composition and makeup of each and every individual person, in each and every being that exists. And so this is what Hahnemann was interested in when he was working on the metals. So here's a quote. This quote is from a great book called Healing the Homeopathic Way, Uniting Shamanism, Alchemy, and Modern Science by York Whitman. And this is a quote from Hahnemann that hasn't actually been translated into English, so far as I can tell. I believe it's taken from journals that Hahnemann was writing later in his life when he was in Paris. But it's such a striking quote, and I'm just going to read it here. It says, "Real homeopathic healing is a true cult, a sacred act, in which the good homeopath represents the place of the creating deity in order to transform the human creature corrupted by illness." And Wickman goes on and he says that this notion of transformation is a thoroughly shamanic and I would add alchemical concept, which does not exist in any conventional medicine in Europe. So we can be sure that at Hahnemann's time, there was no conceptual knowledge of what we today call shamanic, but Hahnemann's using this language. He's using the language of the homeopath as representing the place of the creating deity coming in and transforming the creature corrupted by illness. What more of an alchemical notion can we think of than this? And here's a quote from Jean Dubuis, who was practical alchemist of the 20th century, really nicely encapsulates the understanding of what alchemy is and places it in line with all of what we were discussing about homeopathy. Alchemy, and we can replace the word alchemy here with the word homeopathy. Alchemy and homeopathy are about evolution, and evolution is the raising of vibrations, the refinement or transmutation of the coarse into the subtle. What do we do with our remedies? We take a physical material substance, a coarse matter, and we transform it into something subtle, into something spiritual. We take low frequencies and we transform them into higher ones. We take substances that in and of themselves don't have much medicinal action when they're used in their crude form. We turn them into potentized remedies, and they take on a curative power when they're used according to the law of similars. We take the physical and we turn it into the etheric. That's what we do in homeopathy. That's what our remedies are. Alchemy states that this is the only design and goal of all existence, and then indicates a path or technique which can help nature to accelerate this process both within the human being and around humanity. This process might also be described as a search for perfection for a broader and better life. Well, what does Hahnemann say? What does Hahnemann say about this? Hahnemann describes homeopathy as a search for perfection for a broader and better life. So those of you who have read the Organon, think of aphorism 9. What does Hahnemann say? He says, and here's the quote, in the healthy human state, the spirit-like life force that enlivens the material organism as dynamis, governs without restriction, and keeps all parts of the organism in admirable, harmonious, vital operation as regards both feeling and function. And this is the important part. So that our indwelling rational spirit can freely avail itself of this living, healthy instrument for the higher purposes of our existence. Hahnemann was not just concerned with the eradication of symptoms. Hahnemann was concerned with availing the spirit of all that it needed in order to fulfill its purpose. And this is what alchemy is about, as we see in this quote above. Alchemy is about the evolution of the individual person so that they're able to reach their purpose. They're able to find their purpose. They're able to navigate life in such a way that they fulfill their destiny here on the earth. And it's a search for perfection and for a broader and better life, not only for the human being, but for all of nature. And this is what homeopathy is about too, in its highest sense. Here is a quote from Mary-Louise von Franz, and I thought it was really striking and very interesting and very relevant to our discussion. Von Franz was a direct student and collaborator of Carl Jung. You can see the alchemical influence that's coming through here too, in what von Franz says. But she says, if one does not live up to an inner possibility, right? This is what Hahnemann means, the higher possibility of one's existence. Then this inner possibility becomes destructive. That's why it's important to address. That's why it's important to understand what the higher possibility of the individual is. Because if this is suppressed, just as any physical disease is suppressed, it becomes more and more and more and more destructive, right? And we all know this. If we have a topical issue of the skin, if we have a topical eczema and we suppress it through steroids or antibiotics, it may then translate later on to a deeper seat in the organism. It may become asthma. It's suppressed. It's the same with the inner possibility of the individual person. If it's suppressed, it becomes destructive, which is why for Hahnemann, it's so important to liberate this higher potential, to allow it to speak, to allow it to come through, to allow the individual to recognize the higher purpose of his or her existence. And what von Franz says is that what we often diagnose as neuroses and psychotic disease is actually not lived higher possibilities of the individual person. The refusal of higher development or higher consciousness is one of the most destructive things there is. And that's why Hahnemann emphasized that that's what true health is about. True health is not just about the eradication of symptoms on the physical level. It's about putting the person in touch with their inner possibility, to allow the evolutionary impulses that exist in this person to express themselves in the fullest and most robust ways that they can. And to conclude, I want to share a great quote, one of my all-time favorite quotes from Martin Miles, who was a brilliant homeopath and the author of a book that I think all homeopaths and all supporters of homeopathy should read. It's called Homeopathy and Human Evolution. And Martin Miles says this: homeopathy is above all about change, evolution, knowing and understanding. It is in the truest sense of the term our modern alchemy, but this is the age of Aquarius. It is alchemy for all the people, not just a privileged few. We may all turn the base lead of our gross existence into the pure gold of service, not only for our fellows, but for our own spiritual selves, so that we may shine like living suns. And with that, I will, oh, one more thing. Almost forgot about this. We can look, when we're thinking about Hahnemann and his relation to the alchemists, we need no further proof than looking at what Hahnemann actually did, how he produced his remedies. This is a description of how the remedy causticum is produced, right? He used an alembic, which is pictured here. It's an alchemical device. It's a device that was used by the alchemists to produce medicinal substances. And when you read the description in the chronic diseases of how Hahnemann produced causticum, which is a very mysterious substance and very difficult to produce, Hahnemann was working in the laboratory, refining substances, creating spiritualized substances, creating new substances that didn't exist before. He was interested in working with the generative powers of nature to create novel compounds to heal his patients, and also as an explorer of the innate healing powers of nature. Hahnemann was interested in working with the forces of evolution that were inherent in nature to allow for a greater perfectibility of the human being, and to give this perfectibility back then to the natural world, so that all of nature could reach its state of ultimate perfection, to fulfill its destiny. And so with that, I want to thank you all for your interest and attention, and I'm happy to take some questions and to continue the discussion now. There's a lot more we can talk about on this subject, but I think I've talked enough, and so let's open it up.
Wonderful. Thanks, Victor. To open it up, please pop your questions in the Q&A. There's a few waiting there. I'll go over. But Victor, do you have those last couple of slides? Maybe just before we head to questions, we'll kind of talk a little bit about, we've got another webinar coming up in 3 weeks on June 19th. At the same time, and this one's on agrohomeopathy. So it's agrohomeopathy for your garden, your life, your land. And our presenter is Christina White, who is a homeopath and educator working in Rochester, Massachusetts. And she specializes in agrohomeopathy. So this one will help you learn how to give your plants and gardens a healthy option to assist them with their growth and protect them from the never-ending pests, weather changes, and more. And she describes agrohomeopathy as an inexpensive, chemical-free, non-toxic method of preventing, strengthening, and protecting plants and agricultural resources from pests and disease. It strengthens the plant's basic structure, allowing it to reach optimum health, reducing and eliminating the ailment or susceptibility to other pests and disease. So that is the one coming up next, which will be in 3 short weeks. You can pop over to the next slide, Victor. Victor, this presentation was wonderful. The praise is flowing in. The words of the accolades are flowing in through the chat. So it was amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. It is just, this is why we're here, is to talk about homeopathy, to get Canadians excited about homeopathy, to engage with people about homeopathy. And so keep joining us, keep coming back to the webinars. If you're curious about homeopathy or you have a wonderful story to share, visit us. We're Canadiansforhomeopathy.com. Our email is learn@canadiansforhomeopathy.com. And you can subscribe to our newsletter, and then you'll always know about the webinars coming up. Pay attention to our social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at the moment. And we'd also love to have your support through donations. We are an entirely volunteer-run organization that runs entirely on donations. And we need to do things like buy Zoom and pay website maintenance fees and all that kind of stuff. So we really do rely on it. If you found this webinar worthwhile, as I know you did, we'd love to have any amount. I'll pop the donation link into the chat there. Any amount, if everyone here gave $2, we'd be off, we'd be so, in such good shape. So it does go through PayPal at the moment. Email us if that's not an appealing way to donate, and we can see if we can find another way. But we'd really love to have that. We also are looking for more volunteers. So if you're interested in have a skill set to offer that you think would match with us, let us know. We'd love to hear from you and just keep building this community. So I'll pop that donation link into the chat. And then Victor has generously offered to share his slides. Victor, maybe you could tell people how they'd like them to contact you for that.
Yeah, anyone can write me an email. I'll just go back for a second here. You can go to my website. My email address is there. Send me an email, and I'll just have a link that you can go to and download the slides, and happy to share with anyone who's interested. Send it to my personal email address. I'm happy for people to take an interest in these topics and to read the slides I've prepared in more detail if they'd like.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's so generous of you. And the recording will be up on the Canadians for Homeopathy website in a few days, maybe a week and a half. Sometimes it takes us a little while to get it on. We need our technical person to help us with that. So it'll be up in the next little while. Keep your eyes on that. And fabulous. So let's open it up to these questions here. I've seen them coming in both on the chat and the Q&A, so I'll kind of read them and I'll try and filter back and forth. But if it's a question for Victor, the Q&A is a great spot. So Victor, maybe I'll start by just this one's from DM. Was wondering if you could speak about the nature of cure. And DM says specifically how to tell the difference between each of them. I'm not sure what each of them is. This is from a little earlier in the presentation, but the nature of cure. Can you speak to that, Victor?
Well, it's a big question, the nature of cure. Ultimately, what we're looking for in terms of cure is transformation. We could put it like that. It's a transformation on the level of the innermost spiritual principle of the human being. And so when we're taking a case as homeopaths, and this is one of the unique features of homeopathic medicine, all of this information that to other branches and systems of medicine is completely irrelevant, like a person's dreams. Well, dreams are useful in psychotherapy, for example, but in terms of addressing physical complaints, addressing the person on the overall level, we have all these amazing resources to actually tap in to understand what is the innermost spiritual cause of a given disease. What is it that's actually bothering a person? Where does their pattern of imbalance ultimately stem from? And this pattern of imbalance, as we discover in homeopathy, is an accumulation of, you might call it karma, you might call it destiny, you might call it fate, you might call it experience, that based on the lived experience of a given person, they come to express a certain state of inner imbalance. And what we're trying to do is understand what that image is. What is that coherent picture that is at the root of a person's suffering? And when we can understand what that picture is, what that image is, that image of imbalance, that image of disease, and we match that with a substance from nature that has a corresponding image, then we're touching on the innermost spiritual causes of disease. And that is what the homeopathic cure is all about. It's about finding that most perfect match between the image of disease, which means not only the physical symptoms, it means the dispositional state of the person, how they view themselves, how they see the world, the kind of dreams that they have, how they approach other people, their interests, their hobbies. All of these things are very important to understand when we are prescribing medicines. What is a person especially sensitive to? All of the things that make the person who they are. This is what we're trying to understand. And when we develop that complete picture, that total picture, and we can match it to a similar picture that is inherent in a substance taken from nature, then we give the body the resources that it needs to overcome that state of disturbance and to restore health and vitality on the level of the whole being, on the level of body, soul, mind, spirit.
Wonderful. Love it. We've got another, just a clarification asked about succussion, that it wasn't just shaking, it's actually also the pounding on the bottom of the bottle that,
Right.
yeah, so just, that was just a clarification that came through as a question. So yeah, by succussion, that is what's meant. Victor, you've obviously touched some hearts here. We have people wondering if you do distance sessions as a practitioner, if people don't live in Ontario or can't come to Manitoulin Island to see you.
Well, yeah, I do. It's always great to come to Manitoulin. It's a great place, but yeah, most of my practice is online. So yeah, I do distance sessions with people all over. So yeah, reach out if you're interested in talking more about that.
Great, fantastic. We have a request for literature recommendations.
Mhm.
Yeah, any would
Yeah.
tell more about
So
alchemy and everything you talked about.
yeah, literature recommendations. There's a lot. So my slides have all the references there for everything that I touched on. So I can grab a few books that are on my desk here. So this one I already talked about, Healing the Homeopathic Way, Uniting Shamanism, Alchemy, and Modern Science. This is a great book. It might be out of print now, unfortunately. This is one of the bad things about great books, is that sometimes they're so obscure and appeal to such niche audiences that they don't stay in print for that long. But hopefully you can find a copy. This is another great book. I don't think I referenced it, so I want to show it. It's called The Emergence of Homeopathy, Alchemy into Medicine by Elizabeth Danzinger. And this is a really interesting book. Talks about a lot of the influences from Paracelsus and some of the other alchemists, and how these principles were underlying a lot of the innovations that Hahnemann brought to the table. And I don't want to give the impression, of course, Hahnemann was a great innovator, but his innovations stemmed from a background of alchemical practice, of alchemical tradition. And he took these ideas and he reinvented them. He used them in a new way, which is what alchemists do. They don't just repeat formulas. They take a tradition. That's what it means to exist in a living tradition. That's why homeopathy also has to evolve. We can't just stay stuck in the same methods that were used in the past. The methods of the 19th century are not as applicable as the methods that are coming through today. We need to adapt our practices always. Hahnemann was always adapting his techniques. Hahnemann was always changing what he was doing. Martin Miles, whose book Homeopathy and Human Evolution I also highly recommend, talks about this in that book. And he talks about how the spiritual needs of people, as well as the physical constitution of people, are very different than the people of Hahnemann's time. And as a consequence, we need new remedies. We need new provings. We need new provings of old remedies as well. Because if we just stay working with the materia medica that Hahnemann was using, we're missing out on a lot. We're missing out on a lot of things. And we also, one of the things I want to emphasize, I know this question was about literature, but now these thoughts are coming. So what I want to emphasize is that Hahnemann's choice of remedies that he proved, as we saw, salt, sulfur, mercury, those 7 metals of the alchemists, he chose them because they had cultural significance to him. He understood the symbolic dimensions of those substances, and homeopathy is mostly symbolic. That's what homeopathy is. It's a symbolic practice. And ultimately, what we have to understand is that if homeopathy, this is an example from Anna Vervarka, who's a great Belgian homeopath. She says, if homeopathy was developed in China 2,000 years ago, do you think we would have the same remedies that Hahnemann used? We would have completely different remedies because it's a different time and different place. And so we have to respect the tradition of Hahnemann. We have to be rooted in the classical tradition. We have to understand that the needs of people today necessitates that we have an expanded view of what homeopathy is and what homeopathy can do. And that's one of the core messages of Martin Miles in his book, Homeopathy and Human Evolution. That's one of the core teachings of Jan Scholten, who we referenced. of Rajan Sankran as well, who have done a lot to create a kind of evolutionary view of what homeopathy is. Another person to read is well, Mary Louise von Franz.
Just before you move on, we had someone request the name of the author of that very last book you mentioned one more time. Can you just give
I'll
that
put it in the chat. Martin Miles.
And the one before, sorry, the last book you held up, was that Martin Miles' book?
Oh no, that was it's called The Emergence of Homeopathy. I'll just put it in the chat too.
Thank you.
And so Mary Louise von Franz and Carl Jung, if you're interested in the symbolic dimensions of alchemy and the alchemical tradition, that's a great book. Sorry, it's not a book. Their body of work is excellent. Jung did a huge service reviving interest in alchemy in the 20th century. And so their work is very interesting to consider. It's not about homeopathy per se, but Jungian psychology is very relevant for homeopaths, I think, and for people that are interested in homeopathy, because again, we're dealing with symbolic dimensions of the psychical experience. That's what Jung was interested in. That's what homeopathy is all about. And so one of Jung's colleagues, Edward Whitmont, whose quote we looked at in the webinar, Whitmont was very much concerned with the relationship between homeopathy and alchemy. And so Edward Whitmont wrote 2 books on this subject. One was called Psyche and Substance, and the other was called, I'm drawing a blank, but if you look up Edward Whitmont and you look at his books, the other one was called The Alchemy of Healing. So those 2 books by Edward Whitmont are specifically about the relationship between alchemy and homeopathy and Jungian psychology, and they're excellent. They're great books. And yeah, there's lots to read about this. It's not necessarily mainstream. There's a lot of people that are shy about talking about this, but when you look in a sober way at the evidence of what is actually alchemy, what were the alchemists concerned with? What were they doing? And what was Hahnemann doing? What's this notion of a spirit-like immaterial principle that enlivens the human organism in health and disease? Where did these ideas come from? These are the same ideas that you see in the alchemical literature. It's not coincidence. Sulfur, mercury, salt. These are the 3 basic alchemical principles. It's not a coincidence, right? So some people are afraid to talk about these things because they want to present an image of homeopathy as a very kind of, very clinical and very precise. And it is those things, but it's more than that too. And we need the clinical skills, but we also need insight into the deeper symbolic dimensions of human experience, because homeopathy is mostly a symbolic enterprise. The law of similars is about the symbolic dimensions of experience and the symbolic dimensions that are inherent in material substance. That's why the law of similars works, because there's a law of correspondence that exists in nature. The spirit of life is an emanation of the spirit of the world. That's a symbolic archetypal process. That's what homeopathy is about, right? If homeopathy was not symbolic, our remedies wouldn't work. The skeptics would be right that, it's just water. The fact that we're able to take spiritualized aspects of matter, liberate them from the material sheath, and prepare potencies of basically symbolic substances and give them to people for symbolic sorts of problems that manifest on the physical level, that's why homeopathy works. So
amazing. Wonderful. This is so inspirational, Victor. And you've sparked a bit of a lively discussion in the chat here about polycrests and all that stuff. Thanks for sharing those book names there. Another question that's come in, does having actual metal in your body, for example, because of a broken bone being repaired, interfere with homeopathic remedies or with the ability to evolve harmoniously?
Well, first I'll say something about polycrests, right? A polycrest is a remedy that's very well known. Okay, that's the only reason that they're polycrests. It's because they're very well known, because we've been using them for a long time, because we have very extensive provings. Any remedy can potentially become a polycrest if we understand its full implications, if we do proper provings, and if we have centuries of clinical experience with that remedy. It becomes more and more and more filled out in terms of its powers as a medicine. And of course, some medicines are at some times more relevant, right? When we look at the treatment of epidemic diseases with homeopathy and the genus epidemicus approach, well, we have certain remedies that come to the fore. Those remedies are specific for that time, for that place. But there's no, there's no reason that sulfur is more relevant for the whole of humanity than any other element on the periodic table. Why is there something inherently better about sulfur or more relevant about sulfur than anything else? It's about understanding, is sulfur actually the remedy that the person needs, or is it not? And the only reason that these polycrests that we know are considered to be polycrests is because we've studied them in a lot of detail, because we have extensive provings, and because we have centuries of clinical data to back them up. Remedies that have been introduced yesterday, we don't have that kind of information for. Doesn't mean they don't have the potential to become so-called polycrest remedies. It's all about being precise in our prescriptions, understanding what is actually in need of attention in a given patient, rather than just falling back on a collection of symptoms, right? The repertory is a very useful tool, but it's not the only tool we have. We have also this amazing tool called language and expression, and also observation of the patient, right? Sometimes things can come through in the body language of the patient, in the gestures and the expression of the patient, that can be suggestive of a group of remedies or even specific remedies, right? It's something beyond language. It's a symbolic expression. And when we're able to tap into that symbolic expression, we go beyond thinking just in terms of, oh, these are the polycrests, these are the remedies that we use. Well, there's many other remedies we can use, but we have to understand how to use them. And that's why an evolved concept of homeopathy is what's been introduced in the 20th century and into the 21st century, an evolved notion of homeopathy where we're able to use these other tools to come to our understanding of the curative powers of medicines. And so with respect to the question about metals in the body, I think that it's always a question of susceptibility, right? With everything, and this is a big topic in homeopathy generally. There's people that with the slightest exposure to a certain contaminant are going to have huge amount of symptoms, and they're going to suffer for a long time, and it's going to be very difficult for them to restore health. Other people will come into contact with that same source of contamination and not really be as bothered. They might not notice anything at all, right? And we can think about this not only with respect to metals, but given that it's springtime, we're approaching summer, Lyme disease, for example, right? How is it that some people live in areas that's completely endemic with Lyme disease? There's ticks everywhere, but they never exhibit any symptoms. They never come down with Lyme disease. They're not susceptible to it, right? And so this is one of the things that distinguishes homeopathy as well. This basic question and understanding of susceptibility. Not everyone is susceptible in the same ways. And part of what's involved in a homeopathic case taking is trying to understand what is the basic the pattern of susceptibility of the individual person, that basic pattern. So for some people, they might have exposure to contaminants, metals, whatever it is, and it might be causing huge amounts of problems. Mercury fillings might prevent people from reacting to remedies. Other people might not be a problem. It just depends. And that's with respect to everything. With homeopathy, it's always about individualization. No matter what the question is, we always have to individualize. That's what distinguishes homeopathy from every other system of medicine, really, individualization.
Right. We have a question that's a follow-up from the very first question, if you remember, which was about the nature of cure. And so this question from someone anonymous says, how can we figure out that the underlying spirit of a person to then achieve healing? Sorry, you might need to clarify that. I'll read it again for you, Victor, but sorry, anonymous there, you might need to clarify in the chat for us. How can we figure out the underlying spirit of a person to then achieve healing?
Well, I think it from what I understand of the question, I mean, we're not, yeah, it goes back to the same idea of what is cure? What is the notion of cure? Cure, and the basic principle is to understand what the basic pattern that expresses itself on all levels of the person is. We talk about the life history of the person. We talk about what they remember as a child, We talk about the family history. What happened? Does the person know about what their parents were like before they conceived them? Do they know about anything that happened in the family, any significant traumas? All of these things. We look at the fullest possible extent, the story of the person, and not only the story of the person, but how they've internalized these things that have happened to them, how they express these things, right? Because we can think of a trauma, right? Trauma from, say, abuse in the childhood home. Well, the way that that can be expressed later in adult life varies a lot, right? You might have a person who becomes themselves very aggressive and very hostile. You might have a person that becomes very passive and very shy and very timid. That reaction speaks to the way in which the person metabolizes and internalizes that core experience. So we have to understand these patterns. And when we understand the patterns, then we understand more and more and more what actually is in need of attention in each case. That's basically how, and that's why we take, at least I take at least 2 hours with my initial consultation. I feel you need at least I need at least that much time, because I need to understand who this person is. If I'm really going to get to the essence of what's going on, I need to understand what needs to be cured in this person. And it's not just physical stuff. Everyone has a personality. Everyone has a disposition. Everyone has the unique features that make them who they are. And that's just as important as the physical complaints. And that's what we need to do in homeopathy. And of course, there's acute prescribing and keynote prescribing that's used a lot in places like India, and you can do great work. And many people's lives are saved through that kind of prescribing. But there's also another dimension of deep constitutional work that touches a deeper level, where we're not just working on keynote prescriptions. We're trying to understand what that basic constitutional blueprint is. And we can think of it like, we each have our own unique fingerprints, right? We can think that the vital force of each person also has its own impression, right? It has its own shape, it has its own contours, and it's unique to that person. It's not shared by anyone else. It's your own unique expression that has to do with the forces that brought you into existence, your ancestry, your inheritance, you could say, but also how experience has shaped you in this life, and everything else that we've been talking about. And it's a blueprint, right? There's a shape, it's an image. That's what Kant talked about. Kant talked about the image of the medicine, the image of the person, and the state of disease. And it's not an image in the sense of a movie or a picture. It's an intangible energetic pattern or dispositional tendencies and traits, but also physical tendencies and traits and patterns of susceptibility. All that forms the image, forms what the image is.
Wonderful. Well, I think it looks like we're at the end of most of our questions. There was one, but another question, but I'm going to leave it and just suggest that this person maybe contacts you directly, Victor, to this. There was more specifically about the training in India, and I don't think we are necessarily going to speak to that today. I don't think it's the area of expertise of the webinar. And yeah, so if they want to discuss further, they can maybe contact you. But looks like that's more or less the end of the questions. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for the lively discussion, for your kind words. Victor, so much praise for the webinar. And Victor, thank you for a phenomenal webinar and your enthusiasm. And I think you've kind of gotten all of us inspired. So again, check out the website for the recording in the near future. And yeah, we will see you all soon. Thanks so much for supporting Canadians for Homeopathy, and have a great night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.